Good morning and afternoon. As you can see, we are reaching to an audience living in different parts of the Asia Pacific region. My name is Winston Thomas. I'm the editor-in-chief for CDOTrends, an online magazine that started out examining digital transformation, but now has an unenviable task of also looking at security, data, and of course, AI. Today, we are looking at the edge of that last topic. We are talking about edge AI. The topic in particular for our panelists who will be discussing it is AI's next strategic shift, the rise of edge AI. Think about edge AI, like most AI topic, it is not new. Many see it as a deployment of AI applications on devices or servers in remote locations. At CDOTrends, we see it as extending AI development and deployment outside the cloud, often in an edge computing environment. We had remnants of edge AI with AI applications on devices in industries like oil and gas, construction, healthcare, even financial services. Of course, edge AI is critical in defense and aerospace and is how autonomous vehicles and smart cities are being built on. But generative AI adds a different flavor. We are no longer just bringing any other optimized model to an edge device or to the consumer and processing the data. We are also seeing how large language models can be packaged for edge AI. This obviously has implications on networking and infrastructure. It is also seeing companies taking a serious look at edge computing, peeling the layers of the underlying infrastructure like storage, and even considering whether LLMs are the right approach for the organizations. Maybe small language models are the way to go. To make sense of it all, we have three panelists joining us with three different perspectives. From the solution provider perspective, we have Matthew Oostvin, Chief Technology Officer at Asia Pacific and Japan from Pure Storage. From the analyst community, we have Nitin Acharaga, Vice President, Twimbit. And representing a whole slew of practitioners, we have Alan Song, Executive Director and Head Strategy and Transformation for FSS Financial Markets at Standard Chartered Bank. Before we dive in, I would like to highlight one golden housekeeping rule when it comes to such webinars. That is, please participate. Zoom has kindly created the Q&A button, which you see at the bottom. Feel free to click on it, and I'll pose the question that you asked to the participants. This is not a one-way scripted show. Rather, I invite everyone to participate so we can learn together. Now, let's dive in. And first, to set the context, let's hear what our participants mean when we talk about edge AI. Matthew, maybe you can start the ball rolling.
Happy to. I'll try and be succinct as possible because I think it's easy to get lured into a long description here of what it is. But essentially, it's when we move a lot of the AI capability beyond the realm of the data center and beyond the realm of the cloud as well. Out into, it sounds like antiquated terminology now, out into the IoT, beyond the firewall.
And Alan, thoughts?
Sure. So I think Edge AI, or the value prop behind it, is very aligned with how our organization operates. So just as background, I look after security services. It's a global organization that operates in 60 markets, and we have people on the ground in 40. So a lot of what we do, the data, the processing, is happening on our edge, and hence why the prevalence of Edge AI and ability to roll out these capabilities on the ground with data privacy, security, sovereignty in place opens a lot of use cases for us.
Great. And we'll be exploring some of these use cases later. Nitin, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree, of course, with Matt and Alan, what they said. Having said that, I think edge also is very relative to the organization that we are talking about. For a very large global organization, maybe multinational bank or multinational companies, even a presence in Singapore country, the country office itself can be an edge, right? Whereas in a company in Singapore context, if you look at certain power company, telecom company, their edge will be a certain building, certain branch, certain whatever, right? Certain location as an edge. So that edge definition depends on the relative size and relative complexity of the infrastructure that the particular organization is working on, right? So essentially, but having said that, I think generically agree with Matt that wherever data is essentially analyzed nearer to the user, right? As long as that proximity is nearer to the user, then you can say it's edge AI.
Thanks, Nitin. And yes, you're right. I mean, it is relative. I mean, to the defense organization, edge could be very different from a bank. Let's put it in that context. But we have a poll question now, and as I said, please do participate, and we want to hear from you. So to get your juices flowing and their thought processes occurring, we have a poll question which says, which is asking, what are your organization's key challenges in AI adoption? Please do go ahead and select the question. I mean, the answer. I think you can select as many as possible, and we will come back to that while we talk about how edge AI is creating new revenue streams and optimizing operations. Maybe, Alan, you can talk about, from your perspective, as you mentioned, how is edge AI creating new revenue potential?
Yeah, so maybe starting our story from where every firm is going from, which is building our foundation models in the core and the cloud. I think that's the start of the journey for most people. But what we've been finding is that we do run into roadblocks because of data sovereignty issues, data privacy issues, particularly in our business where our clients' data is their clients' data as well. So there's extra scrutiny. So what we found is that we aren't able to really leverage a lot of AI capabilities, particularly large language models, from the core or from the cloud because of that. Now, with the emergence of edge AI, and I say emergence, I mean edge computing has been around for a long time, but with the ability to, let's say, run a small language model, as Winston alluded to earlier, a 4 gig Llama 2 7B that knows the history of the world and can answer questions and solve problems, doing that on the ground with low latency, with data security, opens up a lot of capabilities around client servicing, running AI assistants across our operational workflow, things that we could just not do from the core or from the cloud. That's the value prop that we're seeing and satisfying clients' needs in a way that are bespoke to certain markets, but able to do it at scale and in a cost-effective way as well.
Thanks, Alan. Matt, what kind of highest value use cases do you see with your clients?
I genuinely mean that it's up to your imagination where we can take this. There's a lot that's changed in the last few years. We've seen something of a Cambrian explosion in the amount of smart connected devices that are sitting outside of the corporate network that are providing reams of data that we can extract value from. And there's a number of reasons for this. I think the big one that I look to is the fact that the price of merchant silicon is approaching almost zero. The cost of making an object intelligent now is just a handful of cents. And so if you think about all of the possible objects that exist in the physical world and the ability to be able to get data from them, meaningful data as well. I mean, even something as simple as a glass of water, you could put sensors in that determine the temperature, how full the glass is, etc. All of this now is a potential data source for us. And I think as we move into this new world where devices are coming online and coming alive, if you will, we need to be able to interact with them differently as well. The voice will be the new keyboard. We can't necessarily have the ability to be able to enter into information into these devices how we traditionally would have done so. And so when we start to mesh in the capability of a large language model, of generative AI, and be able to interface with these smart objects at the periphery, it really is going to be quite wild and quite game-changing for what we're able to do from a technological perspective. So I think, going to Alan's point, we have been edge computing for some time now, but this mashup of edge computing with intelligence is really going to be rather profound. The use cases are endless. I mean, I'm thinking off the top of my head what we could do within the healthcare sector, for example, where we have wearable technologies on patients that can detect falls, that can detect irregular heartbeats. We can improve patient care. We can reduce the amount of time that someone's inside a hospital. We can, hopefully extend the life of patients as well. If we think about also these cornucopia of devices that I'm talking about on the periphery, a lot of them will take on the form of some kind of robotic-like function, where it's just not plausible to be able to process back in a cloud and back in a centralized data center. We need to process at the device. And in circumstances like that, we can really start to drive these devices a lot harder so that they can provide much more impact to society. So I think we're on the precipice now of an enormous amount of change, Winston.
I also like to extend that same question to Nitin. Nitin, what are the highest value cases that you see from your perspective?
I think in his answer, I think Matt talked about some of the technology drivers that drive AGI. I think before we look at the use cases, I would like to highlight some of the demand drivers that we think are driving AGI. And so one of the key demand driver is need for real-time processing to make certain decisions or to take certain actions. Could be from the safety perspective, could be from performance perspective, or could be also from user experience standpoint. So that real-time processing and real-time insight is really one of the key drivers for AGI. Obviously, the closer that you are to the edge, to the user, obviously that decision or action will be more relevant or more valuable from a company and the customer standpoint or that particular user standpoint. The second demand driver is essentially handling of the sensitive data, right? So there are many use cases where maybe, I think, again, Matt talked about the patient care, and obviously we are talking about banking from Alan's standpoint. So all of these sectors handle a lot of sensitive data, and that sensitive data, many times there are certain geographic restrictions, or of course there are certain compliance guidelines where you need to ensure that the data is handled sensitively, and again, which is where AGI can potentially have some value. And also, I think we also, as we compare with the centralized infrastructure versus distributed infrastructure, there could be some cost benefit analysis of having or cost advantages of having that infrastructure at the edge. So that, I think, those are the top three drivers, in my opinion, of driving the use cases of edge AI. And then in terms of specific examples in the banking industry, again, if you look at maybe fraud patterns or it's a certain customer patterns, they may be sometimes localized in a country, and hence again, certain fraud analytic use cases can be localized on edge AI, or customer analytics always will be better off if they are locally trained and locally obviously executed, right? So those are some examples. Even I think there was a mention of edge AI in the context of, say, power sector. That again, because power handles a lot of sensitive data through IoT devices, again, that you may want to deploy edge architecture rather than a centralized architecture where the data goes to a cloud. So again, those are some of the potential use cases. And again, it all depends on, it's a decision that you have to take based on those parameters of whether you want the real-time decision, whether you have certain data privacy issues, or of course, there are certain cost benefit analysis, cost benefit advantages that you have for that use case to be moved to edge.
Okay, that's great. And Nitin, just wanted to clarify, when you mentioned real-time as one of the drivers, real-time, as you mentioned earlier on, is also relative, right? Because to the user, because a decision maker, his idea of real-time is very different from a supply chain executive who's making decisions right up front.
Yeah, I mean, real time can, again, in the context of a customer, or again, let me take the fraud case, right? So if there is certain transaction that you think is happening, so you don't want to delay that decision about fraud too farther down from a time lag perspective, right? So that's why you want it real time. Even in the case of, say, customer interaction, right? So the reason I think there is a talk about RAG and LLM being used in the customer interaction is because the chatbots now, rather than having to wait for a call center agent, a customer to call a call center, and in fact, we all have been on the receiving end of having to hold the call for maybe several minutes, or even I've been on call sometimes for half an hour or something to get to an agent. right? So to get certain irrelevant information. But with the advent of chatbots powered by LLM, and those LLMs in turn are kind of trained through RAG process, where you get the it is trained on the private data of the company. With that, I can actually start interacting with the company on in real time, and I can get real time response from, of course, from AI. But it is, as long as I get my information, I think I'm good, right? So that's where I think real time is very important, and that's where it adds value to the businesses and also to the end users.
Let's go into the poll results. Look at the challenges that have been highlighted. And we have a question down there in terms of a biased view of the poll questions, but we will address that, Ashley. That's a good point. But let's look at answers, and maybe I can ask Alan to actually look at what has been highlighted. Any surprise there, or is it aligned
Yeah,
with, you think?
I think it's very aligned. If I was able to vote, I would have voted on costs. I think that is everyone is trying to be more efficient, and maybe I'll elaborate on that a little bit. Costs on two fronts. One, from an IT operations, IT management perspective, to be able to scale some of these solutions and take the workload off of some of our cloud servers, our core computing, and putting them on the edge is extremely valuable. I mean, we've gone down this route, especially in AI, where you are at risk of over engineering model development, foundational model development for specific use cases that could just a small language model could solve. So going down that route of saving costs. But of course, the main thing that pays our bills is creating efficiencies on the ground with our clients. So again, doing that at the edge for the things that are most relevant to our clients. And I'll give you an example where the real time comes to play. Obviously, many of you know we're moving from T+2 to T+1 to even T+0 on a settlement cycle basis. And as a result, in a T+2 environment, real time is anywhere between 1 hour and 24 hours, right? That's the realistic thing of real time. Now, as you move to T+1, T+0, real time, that lower end, 1 hour becomes 1 minute, becomes 30 seconds, especially as settlement cycles are compressing and you're getting client instructions a minute before the cutoff or 30 seconds before the cutoff. You don't have that leeway like you did before. That's enough that you cannot wait for a server call off cloud or on a core platform located somewhere around the world. That's going to be more and more prevalent, and the service providers that can address that with edge AI particularly are going to be the ones that are winning mandates and winning client requirements.
Thanks, Alan. That's quite good insights. Matt, your perspective from what you see from the results?
Well, I'm always surprised when I don't see cost come out at number one. It's almost number one, Winston, but not quite. Data growth is number one, and maybe that's not such a surprise as well, because we know that data is growing very quickly and it's being accelerated by AI. If we listen to analysts, and I do, Nitin, if I can quote IDC, they say that the amount of data in the digital universe doubles every 18 months. So that's a phenomenally fast amount of data growth, obviously, and it's being realized inside enterprises all around the Asia Pacific region, where we're talking to people that are managing data, managing infrastructure, trying to keep up with this is rather challenging. I do want to address the point on cost just to a little bit more detail and from a slightly different perspective from Alan, because one of the things that I'm looking at really closely in the market here in APJ is the impact of costs from a people perspective. If I go and talk to one of my financial services customers and ask them if they're running an AI project, you get laughed out of the room, of course, but it's how many of these projects that they're running that's rather interesting. And it's just not possible to be able to pull together not only the infrastructure funding, but also the IT talent, the AI talent, to be able to power all of these projects. We're seeing a spike in salaries at the moment for people with AI skill sets. Some of the salaries being thrown around in Silicon Valley are absolutely eye-watering. We're seeing leading AI engineers, and we're talking at the top of the pyramid here, pulling in $10 million salaries. Now, if you're a Singaporean organization, if you're based in Hong Kong, if you're a government institution, how can you possibly keep up with that? I'm not saying that those sort of salaries are being thrown around here in our part of the world, but the rising tide does lift all boats, as they say, and it is getting harder to find good people. And I think that's going to be very heavily entwined with this response on cost.
Nitin, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm also not really surprised to see data growth as one of the number one challenges, and which I think Matt quoted our competitor in that, which obviously the statistics is all statistics nobody can deny, certainly. We also completely agree with that. And I think in terms of cost, yeah, I mean, there are, I think many times when you talk about AI, people will think about, oh, GPU cost, and some of those costs also could basically come into play. But what I would say is AI, in my opinion, needs to be weaved into the business processes, right? And not all AI will require a lot of GPU power. There may be certain use cases which can be somewhat easily executed and may not need so much computing power. Or in fact, you may also use certain ready AI models, because most of the cost of AI it would be in the training cost, especially if you talk about the GPU. In terms of inferencing, you may not necessarily need GPU. Sometimes even CPU is fine, right? I guess uh, while cost is one of the factors that obviously everybody is concerned about in the context of AI, but I think there are certainly use cases that you can find where the relative benefit versus the cost will always be better.
Thanks. And there was one question that I wanted to ask, which is from the audience, which I think was nicely pointed out. It's an option that was not given, which is AI governance. And I think some industries are particularly sensitive about it, while other industries are still waiting for direction. Maybe, Ellen, I'd like to ask that question to you. Challenges. What do you think about AI governance, especially in the context of edge AI? Because we are still struggling with centralized AI.
Yeah, exactly. So another great question with a couple of responses. One is, yes, as edge AI proliferates across the organization, it becomes more and more difficult to apply responsible AI and other frameworks of governance across them. So, I think there are certain organizations that are already in that container-based architecture, Kubernetes architecture, and they're able to apply governance and kind of development lifecycle principles a lot easier. It's still not easy. And then there are others that are traditionally always core, always on the cloud. They don't have much happening on the edge, and it's going to add extra problems. So I'm not from the technology side, but I know that's definitely an area where we put pressure on them. Now, the other side of it, though, is it's also the AI governance, especially when it comes to regulatory drivers, that's actually creating opportunities in the edge AI space. So I mentioned it earlier. There are a lot of things we cannot do in the core or on the cloud. But we can likely, and this is a lot of the work that we're investing in right now, is find ways to adhere to local, global, internal, external governance frameworks by implementing edge AI solutions. Again, I won't go into too many details on what they are, but I think that example of using small language models is extremely powerful, right? To basically be able to go to a client or handle a incoming transaction without having to rely on the entire organization, while still under the same control frameworks, extremely powerful. And we're going to be seeing a lot more of that in the coming year or the coming months.
There's two types of compliance or even regulations, right? We are talking about data regulations, that is true. We can extend that conversation to data sovereignty and what are the challenges faced. But then you have the new AI laws like UX, which are very use case based. It doesn't really look at the data per se, but it looks at the outputs and whether there's bias in itself. So, Alan, from your perspective, as a practitioner, where do you see the challenges? I mean, you're facing two really big buckets of compliance, and banks need to be careful.
Yeah, I think the number one concern right now is explainability. I know we can talk about bias and hallucinations and all that, but I think explainability is going to be the number one thing as we handle our clients' data and as we give recommendations and give predictions and give answers to them. Now, again, edge AI. So if you go down the route of using let's say, open source small language models, explainability might actually be easier because everybody understands and knows and has access to how those models work, and there's less kind of IP concerns about revealing the what's behind the wall. So that might make it easier. What gets harder is when we start looking at, okay, well, I want to fine tune this model to handle a specific use case. Now, the propagation of that control and that governance is going to get multiplied by 60 or however many markets we have, however many layers of governance that we need both internally and then externally. That I would say we're not solved for yet, but is something that is on the horizon and is immensely important to us.
Matt, your thoughts on data sovereignty, and to what extent do we need to go down into the infrastructure layer?
Sovereignty is becoming more of an issue, and I think it'll be one of the bigger issues in 2024, particularly in international markets. We don't hear our friends in the United States talking about it because I think it's less of an issue if you're an American entity. If you're a government agency in the US or a financial services organization in the US, and you want a cloud-based AI project, well, you're probably going to go to one of three organizations. It's Microsoft, it's AWS, or it's going to be Google. Who are the people that are working in those facilities? Well, they're American citizens. They might have Yankee white clearances and security clearances. That's all checked out. And where are those data centers located? Primary, East Coast, secondary, West Coast. But if you start to go beyond the United States and look to Western Europe, there is a lot of unease about where this data is being located and who has ownership of the not just the data itself, but also the physical asset underneath. So we're seeing a rise in legislation being floated in parliaments in France, in Italy, in Germany. The EU is really making a big push on this. And it's not just, like I say, data sovereignty, it's also technological sovereignty. The ability to be able to point to a facility or a data center or a server or a piece of storage and say, this is where information is residing and you do have ownership of that. The expectation from me and the team at Pure and the analysts that I talk to are that this wave is moving in our direction. The expectation in 2024, start to see it rising as a big issue in Japan, in Australia and New Zealand. We're seeing examples of this already with some, I won't say ferocious, but certainly strongly worded legislation coming from nations like Indonesia and Thailand about where data needs to reside and who ultimately has ownership of the information underneath. And this, of course, plays into how we think about structuring and architecting AI. Will it be a bottleneck? It's probably too early to say. Is a architectural style like Edge AI going to work favorably for this rise in sovereignty? And I would say that it is. And it is because with the small language models that Alan was talking about, there's a possibility that we can actually do a lot of processing, not just at the edge, but on the endpoint device. And in those circumstances, data and vital information that isn't actually leaving the device, which is the ultimate from a security perspective and from a governance perspective, and government's quite like that. I think that there's a really strong fit between this rise in the importance of sovereignty and the architecture that we will call Edge AI.
Nitin, your thoughts or figures?
Yeah, yeah, I think Matt really gave a very comprehensive answers, and as I also mentioned at the start, right? So the data privacy and security will be one of the drivers of Edge AI, and I think many countries are moving towards that data sovereignty and also AI governance. I think you are alluding to AI governance rules, kind of regulations coming as well, because I think AI is a differentiator for companies, or will be a differentiator for companies, and also potentially would be at some point in future will also be a potential differentiator for certain economies, right? Who invests, who has the data, who has the models essentially, or who has the talent essentially. All of that will be differentiators, right? So with that in mind, I'm not saying, obviously, I'm not here insinuating that that is a driver for some of these AI governance rules. But I think those are some of the considerations as well that need to be kept in mind. And I think you also were referring to, in terms of AI governance, I think you're referring to the bias, right? And while obviously we need to address bias, and that is uh, that is a given. But having said that, as you may have seen, right, in recent past, one particular global cloud provider, they kind of over-dialed on correcting the bias, and they created a bias in the opposite direction, and almost unreal situation, right? So while we need to correct the bias, at the same time, I will take the word from Alan, what he said, explainability. As long as you can explain the results, bias is okay, right? Obviously, you don't need to undue bias on one side or the other side. As long as it is explainable and rational, it is good. Right, so that's where I think from a governance standpoint, it is I guess, it's a moving train, and the regulations will evolve, and we just have to make sure that whatever actions that we do or whatever models that we develop, as long as they're explainable, and of course the other parameters of legal and all that, as long as we stick by the normal common sense rules, we should be good, and we just move on with it.
Nitin, I
Thanks,
just
man.
want to say this one point on explainability. It does not just extend to the user and explaining where this information came from and how we arrived at a particular conclusion, but it's got strong copyright implications as well. We're seeing 2024 a big rise in perhaps some litigious behavior from entities saying, where did you get this particular information from? Can you prove that it didn't come from one of our data sources, for example? And this is where we're seeing a lot of emphasis and focus now on the training phase, particularly with checkpointing. The AI teams now taking an enormous amount of checkpoints as they progress through the model, so that they're able to rewind to particular points and understand where the source of a particular piece of information came from. This is having a profound impact on the underlying systems, whether you're storing data in the cloud or whether you're doing it in your own facility. The data footprint that comes from all of this checkpointing, we're finding is rather massive, and can be something of a bottleneck for the performance of how quickly you're able to train your model.
Will it be a bottleneck for when you're dealing with edge AI? Because we are talking about different models.
It's a good question. I need to think about that. I would say yes. Because these models still need to be trained, and I'm focusing on the training side here, not the inference side. So, in an inference scenario, I'm less concerned. But when these edge models are being trained, yeah, absolutely, there's still a need to be able to prove that.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think from an inference engine perspective, depending on your architecture, right? If you're training foundational models and you're able to scale that out and distribute that out to the edge, and you can keep the control kind of in the core, you can be effective. But the more that, and again, I think we're going to see this, more localized fine tuning of models or model training per se, that's going to add that overhead, right? Then you need the ML ops team, then you need the model training expert and the governance on the ground, on site, which may not be cost effective.
And who are difficult to find.
Who are difficult to find, especially in a lot of the markets we operate in. It's hard enough to find an operations officer, let alone an AI expert who has a PhD in machine learning.
And as Matt said, we'll be paying $10 million for that.
Yeah, very soon. Yeah.
Now, there was a question which I think is quite good, because we are going ahead, full steam ahead, and we are assuming that edge AI is the future, and this is the direction we want to go. But with edge, as one of the person who actually asked a question, how do we determine whether or not edge solutions are a good fit for business? How do you know that this is the direction to take, or maybe this is not the time to take this direction? Alan, maybe you can look at it from a perspective. I don't think so. You have a choice on moving towards edge. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I think taking a first principles based approach is you apply that same question to any use case you're developing, whether it's AI or not. What's the problem statement? Is it solving problem statement? Can you do it in a cost-effective way? Does the value proposition still hold, whether you're doing this in the core, on the cloud, or on the edge? And you make your decision accordingly. I think the trick is there's a lot of use cases we don't even know about yet that edge is going to unveil. So that really needs to be the focus. And I think the kind of somewhat not answering this question answer is we need to inform people on the ground on the edge across our organization to be aware of this, so they can flush out those use cases more effectively, and we can start developing and prioritizing the ones that make the most sense. Because there absolutely will be tons of use cases that are valuable, but there will also be a lot that aren't, and we just need to cut through that noise just like we do any other automation initiative.
Now, what would you look at to say that you are ready? Usually, when you talk about technology, you talk about people, process, and technology. But how would you know that now is the time to move into edge AI, or maybe we should take a step back and get the others right?
I think what we're looking at is everything that gets blocked sort of internally from our traditional foundational model approach or core and cloud-based approach falls into that hopper of, is this edge AI capable? So I think that's really how you kind of go through the immediate near-term opportunities is large language models. I think there are some firms that are having success with access to large language models, whether it's through, their being on Azure natively in cooperation with Microsoft. That's making it. But even those use cases aren't covering some of the more, client-facing important data that we need for the key processing activities. So if you strip out the stuff that's getting blocked, and instead of taking the attitude of, oh, we can't do it, it's not going to work, maybe edge is the solution, and maybe you should start investing in some of the infrastructure around that.
Matt, maybe looking at it infrastructure point of view.
No, well, not just an infrastructure perspective. I think you've got to be pragmatic about whether to pursue the path or not. And the pragmatism is, for me, focused upon, am I getting important telemetry from the IoT realm, from the edge? Is this telemetry going to add value to my organization and to my customers? The other dimension here, of course, is this broader concept of data gravity. And we've been pursuing this path through edge computing for some time now. And the basic concept says that when data grows to a particular point, when it reaches a critical mass, it's no longer efficient to move the data. It's more efficient to move the software and the infrastructure closer to where that data is being created. And it's that same principle that applies with edge AI as well. If you've got massive amounts of data, it's just not plausible to be able to move that into a cloud. It's expensive, of course. You might have intermittent data connections, slow latency. The networks around Asia Pacific region aren't necessarily the best in the world. I'm thinking of real life use cases here as well. I mean, if we think about Sydney, a city of 6-7 million people as the Greater Sydney area, serviced by 3 coal-fired power stations about 2 hours north of the city. When you walk through and do a tour of one of these facilities, what really blew me away was the amount of cameras that they have. And these aren't cameras that are just pointed at people. These are cameras that are pointed at walls and where human beings don't travel. When I ask some questions about what's going on here, the answer is, well, we've got 2,000, roughly, give or take, 4K cameras, which is about 20 terabytes an hour uncompressed information. We're looking at the facility itself to see if there is small movement, microscopic movement that the human eye won't pick up on, to ensure that these mission critical assets don't go down. Now, you can't plausibly move this amount of information to the centralized data center, which is in Sydney, 200 kilometers away. You need to do pre-processing. Now, of course, you can do some compression by exception and some other type of analysis as well. But now there's a big push to say, let's do as much of the pre-processing and AI edge use case as we can, because if we do that, we can save an extraordinary amount of money, drive a lot of efficiency, improve the outcome for what we're trying to accomplish here, which is improve the uptime of the facility itself. And we don't need IT assets in the form of people managing this infrastructure as well on that edge. So look, I think that organizationally, people are going to be pulled towards edge AI rather than make a choice to go into edge AI.
Just wanted to dig further into, because the company's name is Pure Storage, so I wanted to just dig further into storage. Just wondering, when we talk about when people do edge AI, they're not necessarily think that we're going to have a centralized server. They won't think about the storage implications right up front. But when, as you said, when the data gravity moves or there's a data gravity being created, how do you make sure that your underlying infrastructure, data infrastructure, is malleable enough that it actually evolves with, let's say, there's a data gravity?
Well, the way that I view it is that you don't want anything to change necessarily from the way that you're currently managing your infrastructure. So that means using the same tools, using your same data plane, your same control plane, management plane, et cetera, and extending that to the edge point. It's not necessarily going to mean that you're putting flash storage inside a wearable device, but if we think about Nitin's examples at the start, where we're talking about robo or remote office and branch office, there's absolutely use cases there to say, well, you might need a little bit of infrastructure to store and pre-process information, but that infrastructure needs to be, self-managed. You can't have a person sitting there tinkering around at the edge. It needs to use the same control and management plane that you're currently using with your tool sets. You want to make sure that there's a low power draw, and you'd want to make sure that the infrastructure contained within it doesn't have things like moving parts. Mechanical hard drives are 20 times less efficient than flash storage, for example. They happen to use 20 times more electricity as well, if we want to have an ESG conversation around this. So certainly we'd be advocating for small, light flash storage systems that interconnect with your current management plane and data plane.
Nitin, your thoughts on what has been said by Alan and Matthew?
In terms of the relevance of the infrastructure for edge AI?
Yes.
Yeah, I think as by definition, edge infrastructure will be more distributed. So I agree with Matt that one of the key hallmarks that we need to look at is manageability of that infrastructure, because while it goes at the edge, it can create a lot of complexity if there is human intervention involved in terms of managing that. So automation and manageability will be one of the key. And also the other factor is security, right? So that infrastructure should lend itself to provide the relevant security, maybe in terms of the data access controls, centralized data access controls, I mean, right? So essentially, so that the data can be completely, cannot be misused by the unintended users. And the third factor will be performance, right? So I think while it is at the edge, and many times the reason that you want that infrastructure at the edge or AI at the edge is because you want that response time to be faster, right? So the last thing you want is that the architecture that you choose or infrastructure that you choose actually adds a delay and kind of counteracts against your objective. So those are the top three in my mind, the factors that one would consider in selecting the infrastructure for those edge AI use cases.
Now, there seems to be a topic that is coming out with all the questions from the audience, and that is basically edge AI and security. And I also like to extend it to data security and maybe even look at it from a data quality lens. So how do we ensure data security, data quality at an edge when you have a deployment at the edge or when you deploy edge AI? Alan, you want to take a go at this?
Yeah, I'm probably the least expert in this field here, but I would say that, again, the same principles we apply everywhere will apply to edge. It's more the challenge of, can you scale the right resources, skill sets, frameworks in those specific locations? And if you do that from the central groups or the hubs, maybe it diminishes the value of having these capabilities on the edge, right? So I think that's definitely something to consider. I'm still in the boat where I view all those data privacy restrictions, data sovereignty as opportunities for moving onto the edge, because they're currently bottlenecks for our current approach of coming from the core or coming from a hub. But I'll defer to the others in terms of what are the technical aspects of driving improved security.
Just wanted to expand on the policies and frameworks. How do you actually extend, let's say, a data quality management framework or even a security framework, which tend to be very centralized, to the edge or in an edge AI perspective?
Yeah, it's all about having those the definition of where your edge sits. I think to Matt's point, that could be regionally, locally by market, or on the end user device or computing. So that needs to be defined in your. I guess you can start with your data quality management framework. That's one starting point. Understanding where your data is coming from at that level of granularity. To your point, Winston, is not necessarily done to the scale that needs to be to enable the governance of these AI capabilities. So I would recommend that being the first step. So when you talk with your CDOs and the people who run data quality management in your firm, understand how your domains are broken down. You usually have subdomains. Sometimes you have regional domains, especially if there are jurisdictional regulatory requirements that drive that need. You might need to go one level down, and that might require another 5 people in the CDO team to manage. So all those costs again start adding up, but it is a necessary evil, exactly to your point, to make sure that the governance framework is extended in the same way that your edge capabilities are being extended as well.
Nitin, thoughts?
Yeah, I think the question is around the data quality, right?
Data quality
So
and data security, both.
yeah. So the way I look at it in the context of AI, and even before that, actually, we believe that the data will be seen as a product, right? So for different use cases, you want to deliver that a product, data as a product. And as you look at data as a product, then obviously then you need to ensure that the quality of that product needs to be maintained, right? So essentially that's where we need to we have to look at the entire life cycle of the data from the time it originates to all the way, of course, it is processed and then stored back and maybe even archived. So through that entire process, we have to ensure that that quality is and consistency is taken care of. And of course, the other part of data governance is ensuring that all the data is essentially synchronized, especially in the context of edge AI, because the data kind of will be distributed across different locations or different edges, so to say, right? So that's where again it is important that the quality of that overall data is maintained, and consistency of that whatever parameters that we are capturing and the model that we create based on that is also consistent. So in that context, that data quality and the quality of the or consistency of the AI models, while they may differ for different edges from the specific maybe weightages in the parameters and something like that, but the basic parameters should be same for all the models. So which is where I think we need to, there of course there has to be an effort to ensure that that quality of data as well as quality of the AI models is taken care of.
Matt, you wanted to add something?
Well, we've all heard the saying, data's the new oil. I think I put a twist on it. Data's the new uranium. It's incredibly useful if you know what you're doing with it, and it's incredibly dangerous to just to leave lying around. In a framework like Edge AI, where we're able to contain information on an end user device, brilliant. That works in favor of this architecture. Unfortunately, the other side of the coin is, depending on the type of architecture, that we are opening up our attack surface quite considerably, and I think that would be concerning many CISOs. I'm sure they're actively involved in looking at ways of mitigating and protecting information as well as corporate networks. Our advice on this to organizations, of course, is to look at what the most common type of attack vector is for a large organization. And today, that's a ransomware attack. Ransomware attackers, no doubt, will be looking at opportunities to manipulate this framework, this architecture to their own advantage. So, work under the assumption that you should always be working under, which is that at one day, inevitably, you will be attacked. And what do you do to be able to bounce back and recover as quickly as possible without losing any of your customers' data? The way that you do that is that you use a snapshot technology that is immutable, so it can't be deleted by even a system administrator with the highest level of privileges. Make sure you've got many distributed copies of that as well, so that you're able to rewind to particular points in time. We've been actually working on a new technology. It's the first of its kind in the industry that enables you to detect a ransomware attack while it's taking place. So obviously one of these attacks doesn't take just 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Normally they lurk within your system for a number of weeks or perhaps months. Because Pure has so much detailed information on the behavior of our customers' arrays, we're able to detect in real time when a ransomware attack is actually occurring in the first few moments. before it gets to weeks and months later, so we can discreetly talk to the CIO and the security team about how to head off the attack that's underway, because inevitably these attacks are going to happen. For the technology practitioners here, your KPI 0 is to stay out of the news, and a ransomware attack and a security attack, of course, is a great way to get onto the front page. So certainly want to avoid that with the path of pursuing this as an architecture. But there's lots of things that we can do, and I wouldn't let security be a handbrake to the enormous opportunity that awaits. I'm of the opinion right now that we're not in a world of worrying about optimization or over-rotating towards security, but looking at the immediate ROI that's available, and of course, the tailwind that comes from being the first mover into this space. There's a huge advantage there.
Matt, I just wanted to ask, when you move, like you mentioned, when you have a data gravity, and when we are talking about not just collecting data, we are also processing data, we are also storing the generated outputs. Wouldn't that make edge AI like a bigger target now, because for a lot of bad actors?
Yeah, and it's not a model we're unfamiliar with. The type of application perhaps has changed, but as we've been discussing through this webinar, we've been utilizing edge IT for some time. Those security principles are largely the same. They don't necessarily change. Perhaps we can use AI to our advantage to detect when one of these attacks are underway. But we've all read the article on Wired magazine about a particular organization that got hacked through a Samsung smart fridge and these types of things. There is always going to be a security arms race as the hackers find exploits, and we in the enterprise side try to outwit and outsmart them, but it will continue.
Great. We are reaching the end of our discussion. Felt like as if it is just 15 minutes, but we seem to have gone for an hour. Maybe we can look at rounding it off with some last thoughts. Alan, what's your first and most important advice when people talk about edge AI?
My first advice is understand what it means. Understand the applications that are already being used and the stuff that are being looked at in the future. And it's as simple as, I use this example all the time because I think this is what got me over the edge when it comes to edge AI, is the fact that you can take a open source model like a Llama 2 that Meta and Facebook spent $40 million to build, that you can download for free. It's 4 gigs for the 7B, maybe 8 gigs for the 13 billion parameter version. You can run that on most computers. You can buy a $100 single board computer, Raspberry Pi, and run the 7B on it. And it gives you the history of the world. It gives you answers to your questions. It'll write a poem for you. And if you fine tune it and you apply it to your operational process or your client servicing needs, it can also solve for a lot of those things in a off-grid manner. I mean, the world could end and you would have Wikipedia at your hands through your large language model to an extent. That's, whether or not that's a direct application, that opens your mind to like what the possibilities are and the power of it, which I think most people don't know. Most people view AI as huge foundational models. You have to have huge data farms and GPUs to get anything done. So the scale of it just enables so much from a cost perspective, from a security perspective, from a speed perspective, from just a usability perspective. Immensely powerful. I just recommend people to understand those capabilities and then apply that to your use cases on the ground.
Nitin?
I would say that I think one of the key things that companies need to keep in mind that AI is not a technology issue, right? Or edge AI is not a technology. It's a business problem they're trying to solve. As long as there is a business problem, then of course, then you can choose the right solution. And if edge AI meets those criteria in terms of what we discussed, real-time response or data gravity, as I think Matt mentioned, and of course cost benefit analysis of using on the edge versus doing at the core, right? So number one is a business problem. Number two is that because it is a business problem, it is I don't think any AI or edge AI will need a teamwork, and of course there need to be a leadership sponsored for that initiative, right? Without these things, the AI initiative will not succeed, right? And Thirdly, essentially, you look at the what are the use cases that we can execute for those business problems, and then select the use case and select the right architecture. If AGI happens to be the right architecture, choose it. We cannot go with the mind that, oh, I must deploy Edge AI here. That approach will not work. The use case will choose architecture rather than you choosing use cases.
Thank you. And Matt, your advice as well as key takeaways from the discussion today.
Well, act quickly. Velocity is key here. There is certainly a first mover advantage to be taken into consideration. So organizationally, if you believe that there's value to be extracted from the data that exists out in the periphery, then absolutely you should be thinking about how to utilize that information, and always view this through the prism of your customers. How can you delight a customer more? How can you be more relevant to the customer base and continue to add value to them? From an analytical perspective, look across your organization and conduct some forecasting on how much data is actually residing outside of the cloud and outside of the data center. Depending on your industry, you may have reached an inflection point, last year, or you will this year, where the amount of information available to your systems outside the corporate network exceeds that of what you've got inside your own data center and inside your cloud. Well, if those sort of imbalances are occurring, then you absolutely should be looking at this as a path forward. In fact, you'd be mad not to.
Thank you. And as Matt said, be customer centric and do it now. Now, thank you, gentlemen, for a great discussion. I hope the audience, feel a bit wiser after this session. I certainly do. And we also want to hear from you what you thought about the entire discussion. So we do have a feedback form, and you see it. Do just scan the QR code, and it's simple 3 questions, which is less than a minute. And we will love to hear what you just said. We always treasure your feedback, so we can continue to optimize this discussion, just like what we are doing with AI. Now, on behalf of CDOTrends and our partner Pure Storage, and our participants from Twimbit and Standard Chartered Bank, thank you, and have a safe rest of the week.